Thank you for that introduction. Good evening, and thanks for inviting me to the Institute of Advanced Study. You may have heard that Leuven also has founded an Institute for Advanced Study, but we were later, you were first. So the credit is for you. I don't think we had I mean, obviously in Leuven, it's all about healthcare as it's the main topic, but indeed today I'd like to talk about food. PowerPoint is gone, so can you? I'm from Leuven University, where I teach agricultural economics. So I have a very specific interest in what's happening in Brussels. And it's actually a very topical topic, because yesterday was a big day because the European Parliament voted in favor of the new common agricultural policy. And it was an event which was 3 years late, because it was supposed to happen 3 years ago. So we had a very lengthy process of reform. I'll come back to that later, because the common agricultural policy is, of course, the core still is of food policy. So the title of my presentation is the EU's Farm to Fork Strategy, the difficult road towards a European food policy. So a couple of questions that I would like to address today is, what is that, a food policy? Why do we need a food policy? What is the food system to begin with? How has it evolved over time? What are its challenges? And I'll not be able to address all of it because I only have an hour time. If I would really give a comprehensive talk, well, it'll be a course. I mean, it's simply impossible. So I really picked out some main messages, some main lines. Why don't we have a food policy today? Because obviously, if there is a difficult road towards a food policy, it means that we don't have one today. So what happened there historically? How should it then look like? And does the farm to fork strategy live up to becoming or being a food policy? So I need to explain a lot of things in this presentation. I'll do it through 4 narratives, 4 stories. I'll start with a very quick, rough, brief overview of the evolution of food systems. The reason I'm doing that is I want to, stress some very important aspects of the food system that actually matter when we talk about food policy. Then I'll have a very quick look at the history of the EU's common agricultural policy. So from a 10,000-year, 12,000-year time frame, it'll go to a 70-year time frame. I'll briefly touch on the climate crisis because it very much frames the Green Deal. The Green Deal, the current strategy of the European Union of dealing with the climate crisis. And then I'll zoom in to the farm to fork strategy, where I link that strategy with these narratives and what I said before. What is it really a food policy? A graph I like a lot is this one. This is the old food triangle. In Belgium, we used to have this kind of food triangle in our educational system to educate people what to eat. And why do I like to show it? And now we have a new one, which is upside down, which is, I think, less educational, because this one tells you or gives you a reflection of what a food system actually looks like or should look like. This is from colleagues from Cianzano. They plotted onto this food triangle what people are actually doing. Yeah, so it's kind of the food triangle itself is how it should be, and the colored images are what we actually do as consumers. And so the bottom is physical activity, where we only do on average 30% what we should be doing to be healthy. The second one is water. That's pretty okay. And that's my main point. The basis of our food system is grains. The reason I bring it up is that this will be one of the red threads. It's because, well, grains is our number one staple food that we need to survive. Yeah. There we're also doing quite well. You see that it is we even can eat a little bit more. Then we have fruit and vegetables. Obviously, we eat far too less of it. And then we have a second major aspect of the food system, which is our protein sources, dairy products and meat, and especially meat we eat far too much. And then we have on top, these are the things that we should not eat at all, but we eat a lot, which are the nutrient-poor, energy-dense foods, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, especially beverages. Why do I show this? Because this is a reflection of how consumption looks like, but of course consumption mirrors production. So it's also a mirror of how production looks like. So if we talk about food systems, in the first place we talk about cereals, and we talk about protein sources, and then we talk about vegetables and fruits, and and everything else is actually is not so important. So in terms of food security, these carbohydrates that we need for energy, the protein sources we need is really vital. So how have food systems roughly evolved over time? Well, here I've, as I said, done a very quickly a rough overview of the three large periods. There are actually more, and typically we look at agricultural history in about 7 or 8 different time slots. But so I've combined a couple. We started eating cereals 10,000 years or 12,000 years ago. Cereals means wheat in Europe, rice in Asia, maize in the Americas. And actually, that's already been the biggest transition in history, because ever since that's became the basic staple of our food system. Before that, it wasn't. Yeah, people were hunter-gatherers, and the diets were quite different. The role of animals was quite limited. There was some shepherding of sheep and goats and so on. Labor we were in a feudal system, so was very much in serfdom, slavery, share tenants. The frontier to increase production was a land frontier. We just expanded land. There was no need for technology to save labor because we had slaves. There was no need to intensify because we just expanded land in various ways by taking over other countries, like in the Roman Empire, or later in the Americas, by just going west. But it's also a time with regular famines. Famines was part of daily life throughout that part of history. And as I said, in terms of policy, we had the feudal system, or if you look at other parts of the world, a more communal system, but which is also basically more or less feudal. And agriculture is actually, as it is the main part of reality, is also the basis for example, fiscal revenues. It's a situation of low development where the only economic activity on which you can raise taxes is agriculture, because that's most there is. And that's also how society was organized. You had to pay 20% of your harvest to the abbey and 10% to the, that kind of systems. So after the Middle Ages, that changed in, let's say the 15th century up to the 19th century. Animals came more and more, innovations came into play. Plowing was actually an invention made in the kind of plowing we do today. Was an invention made in Flanders in the 15th century. And animals were more and more part of the system, which means that farmers had more nutrients, more labor, or substituting slave labor for animal labor. And so which means that yields could increase drastically. Still, production was increased by increasing the land frontier, increasing also abroad, not only locally. And you could say these animals constituted a form of biological intensification. Yeah, so intensification started, let's say, in the 15th century by basically by pinning down animals to the fields and no longer, having them run around across the country where the goodies, the nutrients, the manure, were actually lost to the environment. And that also enabled a true nutrition transition in which diets, which were poor, which were high in calories but low in vitamins, low in proteins, because they were mainly cereal-based, with now and then a little bit of meat, to a diet much richer in protein. And this is a transition called the nutrition transition. It took place in different countries at different times in history. So we could say that for us, it's this period in which it took place, maybe 19th century, rather than the 15th century, if you take the larger population into account. But there are still countries across the world in Africa that are in the middle of that nutrition transition now, like the Sahel, the sub-Saharan countries. And then the third period, 19th century, that's where fossil fuels, of course, came into the game. Chemicals as basis for nutrients, the Haber-Bosch procedé that enabled us to make nitrogen-based fertilizers out of the air, because the air is basically nitrogen. All kinds of other inputs, pesticides. We also had biotechnological innovations, a process later called, and then we are in the 20th century, the Green Revolution, which was a project of modernization, of productivity, of specialization. And we have also a turn from agriculture as a basis of taxation towards subsidizing farmers. Farmers that used to be 30, 40, 50% of the population, of the active population, towards a system where they are only 10% and nowadays 5%, and in Belgium even 1% of the population. And of course that coincides also with an era of globalization. So specialization means not only specializations of farms locally, but also across the globe, where production takes place, where the terms are most the most favorable. But of course that created what we can call an obese food system. I think we know by now, and I put obese between brackets because obese means, the use of these fossil fuels basically concentrated a huge amount of energy, and in the case of agriculture, nutrients, and that kind of created an obese system in many effects. And I'll just a couple of pictures to show that. This is a picture that is often shown to see the increased amount of choice we have today. Yeah, too much actually. A picture from a supermarket. Of course, people's diet. This is a famous series of pictures from 1 week's menu of families throughout the world. This is Australia, by the way. And the obesity, you could see how the bad food groups, the meats, the sugary drinks, the energy dense carbohydrates are very much prominent, and that also, of course, leads to obese people. And that, of course, also plays out at the planetary scale. This is a picture of the planetary boundaries. Obese means that because of that, these nutrient-related, so these biochemical flows, especially nitrogen, because if you start concentrating nitrogen from the air into water and air in another form, in an active form, but also phosphorus, which is mined from mines in North Africa, for example. These keep accumulating, and they surpass certain boundaries with negative consequences for the environment, for human health, for ecosystem health, and so forth. And also biosphere integrity, biodiversity is another, is of course hurt by this obesity of activity, basically destroying biodiversity. So that means that, and even if you see the yellow areas, land system change and also climate change, that those areas in which we surpass planetary boundaries are food related. And as you can see, climate change is not even the biggest problem here. on a planetary scale, it is actually nitrogen, it is biodiversity much more, where we already surpassed some of these barriers. This is also obesity. This is food waste. 20%, maybe 30% of our food is actually not used, is wasted in some way. In southern countries, it's wasted or lost because of bad conditions, but in our countries in the West, it's wasted because of bad form or beyond the due date or just being careless, and it's more taking place at the consumer side. This is deforestation. This is palm oil. It's also obesity, monoculture of palm oil, for which forests in Southeast Asia was cut, or megastables, which is the standard way of raising chicken, for example, chicken for meat. You could say, aren't these kind of industrial ways of growing animals? Are they not obese systems, so to speak? So that's my first narrative. So throughout history, we've been so successful. And actually, why have we done that? Our red thread throughout that has actually been what is the kind of food policies that all these civilizations have been following? Well, it's, to use or to paraphrase the Romans, panem et circenses, it's bread and games. Yeah, cheap prices for staple foods has been a constant throughout history. So governments have always played the card on keeping prices of the staple foods as low as possible. And we see that still today. When in 2007 and 2008, wheat prices skyrocketed, it sparked the Arab Spring in North Africa. People in Mexico came on the street because their tortillas became too expensive. So unrest follows high food prices, which is why obsessively even governments want to keep food prices low, which is a very important thing to remember, because it's an important red thread, an important barrier also later on if you want to fix some of these problems. Okay, my second narrative is the history of the Common Agricultural Policy. Here we are more recent in history. So the Common Agricultural Policy is basically used to be 2/3 of the total budget of the EEC in those days was spent on agriculture. Now it's still 1/3, so it's still the biggest budget item. And the reason is that the European Union, when it started with 6 countries just after the Second World War, used the agricultural area as the first area to make a unified market. We realized the unified market for agriculture and food in 1962. The rest of the economy followed only in 1992, 30 years later. So agriculture and food was kind of a strategic area to do this. We came out of the Second World War. No more hunger. In some countries, hunger was a big issue. But it also was a kind of a testing ground for the rest of the economy. The European Economic Community was, of course, about coupling the economies of France and Germany in the 1950s. Later on, it was countering the threat of communism in Eastern Europe. The idea was indeed to create a large internal market for food first, and agriculture played a very important role throughout that history. Even got a separate chapter in the treaty, the first treaty, the Treaty of Rome, in the very beginning. And actually, it's very telling if you look at the objectives, the old objectives of the Common Agricultural Policy laid down in the Treaty of Rome in the 1950s. And I'm reading them together with you. And the objectives of the CAP shall be to increase agricultural productivity. It's the first objective. Yeah, so that mirrors what I said in the third period. It was a project of modernization. And that modernization, productivity increase, is the basis of everything else. By promoting technical progress, ensuring rational development of agricultural production and the optimal utilization of factors of production, and in particular labor, which means that incomes, which you can see in point B. Thus, and thus is a very important word. Thus means in this way, by raising agricultural productivity, ensuring a fair standard of living for the agricultural community. This thus is in the treaty. It's often forgotten when people give talks like this, but it's essential. Yeah, it was written. This was the basic model for agricultural policy. And then to stabilize markets, that's number 3. To assure the availability of supplies, a food security objective, you could say, and to ensure that these supplies reach consumers at reasonable prices. Yeah, so these are more food security related objectives. But this was the basis. This was the project. Increase productivity. We are in the 1950s. Mechanizations just started. The Green Revolution just started. There was already, of course, set in motion in the 19th century this dynamic of shifting labor out of agriculture into industry. Of course, that already happened. It's not that this is a new dynamic. It's a dynamic that came out of the 19th century, following the Industrial Revolution, obviously. Yeah. But this project of modernization, this is how it started. And the problem with that is that if you look at the historic development, what happened since 1958 is that there's a number of phases through which that common agricultural policy went through a reform. And the most important one is this dotted line here. It's really a milestone. This is 1992, Commissioner McSherry, the 1992 reform, in which the common agricultural policy completely changed. And this is what some people often forget. Some people still think that we are having this old pre-1992 policy. And I would like to show you what it means, because it's quite important to know that difficulty, because you often read in the press or in opinions that people make statements that may be true for 1990, 1980, but not anymore. And the reason is that in this old CAP, the main instrument was minimum prices. And minimum prices means high prices for farmers, guaranteed minimum prices, but only for a set of essential products. And here the food triangle comes back: grains, cereals, dairy products, beef, sugar, wine, and olive oil. Only for these products. So not for vegetables, not for fruit, not for pigs, not for poultry, not for potatoes, but only for these products that were very high minimum prices, guaranteeing, of course, also income. The problem is, if you do that, if you fix prices at a very high level, of course, everybody wants to produce more. This was, of course, fueling the modernization project, but you end up with surplus. Milk lakes, butter mountains, especially in the dairy sector, we had huge surpluses. So production quota were introduced in the 1980s for milk and for sugar. And there was what we call the second pillar of rural development, in which subsidies was given to farmers, mainly to fuel that project of modernization, giving subsidies for new stables, giving subsidies for new tractors, giving subsidies for the modernization project. That was the before 1992 situation. So no environment, no human health, nothing, the rest of the food system. It was a very much an agricultural policy focused on farmers, only on farmers. And that changed. Why did it change? Well, because of all kinds of pressures. This is very, because if you have a high price within the European Union, it means that you need a big tariff to make sure that that people outside the European Union cannot import at that high prices. So there was a huge tariff barrier for other countries to import into the European Union. And of course, when surpluses arise, the reverse happens. European Union paid export subsidies to dump these surpluses on the world market, and that, of course, that was triggering a lot of resistance worldwide. Vis-a-vis the European food system. So these were some of the most important pressures on the system to change completely direction, and that happened very gradually. It didn't happen all in 1992. Actually, the last reforms were just finished in 2015, so it took kind of 23 years to effectuate this this reform, in which these minimum prices were abandoned gradually, step by step. So no longer minimum guaranteed prices, but world market prices. But as compensation, those farmers, so the cereal farmers, the dairy farmers, the beef farmers, the sugar farmers, the wine farmers, the oil farmers, got direct income payments, an annual check of money, amount of money, a fixed amount of money, but no longer coupled to production. Yeah, so it's a fixed amount, historically set per hectare, and it, you know, whatever you plant on your land, it doesn't matter, you get that amount of money. So it doesn't stimulate you anymore to do more cereals or to do more dairy or anything else. Yeah, that was the idea. Also, the environment entered finally, because in the 1990s, the negative implications of the obesity system, of course, came into place. And some of that income payments, and it got stricter and stricter and stricter with every reform, became conditional on fulfilling some environmental indicators. We had some market measures to stabilize markets a little bit. And this second pillar, this rural development, was no longer only oriented towards modernization, but also a project of keeping rural areas vibrant, because what happened is that, especially in certain countries in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, lots of people left rural areas for the city. And so there was land abandonment in many areas. You could see that in the north of Spain, in the south of France. So there was so more money was being invested in keeping these areas attractive, into alternative businesses, the business development, think of tourism, and also for the environment. So if I go back to these different phases, so the early years we had price support, productivity improvement, and of course, if you had a fixed price, your internal market was stable. That was the beginning. It resulted in the crisis years in the 1970s and 80s in overproduction. Of course, the budget increased a lot with all these export subsidies, international frictions, supply controls, quota, production quota. And then in 1992, these were, the system was completely reversed, price cuts, compensation payments. And that then was actually in every reform after that, Agenda 2000, a cap reform in 2003, 2008, 2013, and even today, because yesterday was the vote, it's the same direction. So more of this kind of market orientation, more environmental concern. Many say not enough, but even today with the new cap, quite a lot of money needs to be spent on the climate crisis, for example. So that's part of the new narrative today. This is also mirrored in, this is the budget and how it, so this is the budget in billion euro in current prices from the beginning, no, not the beginning, from 1980 to 2020. And here you can see the red bar here. This is the export subsidies. So this is the worst part of the Common Agricultural Policy. This is what people refer to when they say about the European dumping on export markets with subsidies. Well, that's these export subsidies. We did that, especially in dairy. But you can see that since 1992, there was a phase out. And since 2012, they don't exist anymore. They're completely gone. Yeah, we don't do those export subsidies anymore, but we do have these brown and then later green bars, which is the direct income support. So actually, the result of this reform is that, or the paradox is that it costs more money, or it seems to be costing more money. The reason, of course, is it now appears on the government budget, but of course, before, it was the consumer who was paying the bill with the higher prices. And if we talk high prices, we talk 3 times higher than abroad, 2 times, 3 times higher. So basically, if you would look at the total budgets, also the one of the consumer, then of course you would have a much more stable graph here. But this is the government budget just to show how the instrument use has been changed. And notice also the blue bar on top. The blue bar is what we call the second pillar, rural development, the modernization project, investment subsidies. In the beginning, it was about 5% or less of the total budget. And you can see that in each case becoming bigger and bigger. And so more and more attention to environment, to rural areas, and also more and more budget. But still, if you look at the 2020 bar, 10–15%. So many would say, well, actually, this green bar should disappear in favor of that blue bar. Everything should be blue. We should actually be stimulating environmental payments, innovation only, and also get rid of these direct income payments. But that didn't happen. We now have a new cap starting in 2023, voted yesterday by the European Parliament. It was proposed 2 years or 3 years ago by the European Commission with new objectives. So no longer the Treaty of Rome, but a broadened set of objectives, reflecting a little bit more the challenges that are in the system. Not yet food system yet. And we can still see ensure a fair income for farmers, increase competitiveness, rebalance power in the food chain. And so that means that giving farmers more power vis-a-vis supermarkets and big food companies. And so it's still farmer oriented. But then we have the environmental goals coming in, climate change, environmental care, preserving landscape and biodiversity, vibrant rural areas, which I mentioned before, support generational renewal. This is, we have on average, our farmers are 50-something years of age. There's very few young people who want to enter into agriculture. And then the last one, the rest of the food system enters a little bit, protect food and health quality. Yeah, so there is a little bit of consumer entering, but still, 99% of the budget still goes to, all the areas that I said before. So that's the second narrative. Yeah, we have a food system that was intensifying, specializing, concentrating, and at the end now is becoming obese in various ways. We have, of course, a policy project that has supported that very much, a productivity driven. And why is that important? Because it creates a lot of path dependency. Yeah, this is ingrained in so many things in the system, in the food system, that it is extremely difficult to turn some of these very deep processes of, cheap prices, productivity increase to change that course. Very briefly, a third element, which is the climate crisis. And again, I want to, I call this the climate crisis, the climate confusion and the climate complexity, because again, a lot of things are being said about the food system and climate. So a couple of facts to get the numbers right, I think, is in place. And the reason why it's confusing is has to do with the food system and also the way we count carbon, which is particularly a problem in the food system. Let me explain. And this is based on a very recent paper that came out at the beginning of this year that recalculated the share of the food system in the climate, in global warming, where by then it was estimated at 25%, and they said with new estimations, it's 1/3. 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to the food systems. That makes the food systems the biggest challenge. Yeah. But this is new. This is not that we didn't know that. I thought it was buildings and energy, fossil fuels, so energy. Yeah. But if you look at it from a global perspective, it's actually 1/3. But it's globally. So no one. If you look at it, how that is broken down, you can see that most of that. So this is the breakdown of that 1/3 globally. yeah, you can see that actually most of it, 3/4 of it, is related to agricultural production and land use change. And land use change is mainly deforestation. Yeah. And you can see that actually the transportation, we should go local. It's about 5%. Processing, about 5%. Packaging, about 5%. Retail, about 5%, and that's to do with cooling. Consumption itself, a couple of percent, and then of course there's waste, a bit bigger. Yeah. So if you want to change the system and you want to see where the big levers are, it's in production and it's in land use change. This is why, was it last week? The European Commission had this deforestation law where we stop, where it is mandatory, where we cannot buy any more food from deforested areas. And this is why it's so important to focus on the agricultural production phase. But this is globally. And you'll be surprised how that is different, for example, for Belgium, because where does that take place? Well, it takes place in Indonesia and Brazil. Yeah. Actually, much of that also. Yeah. And so if you focus on a, okay, no, I'll come back to that later. Yeah. Now, if you read the newspaper, you typically see, oh, in Belgium it's 10%. So globally 1/3, in Belgium 9 or 10%. Well, actually, to tell you the truth, the full story, when we talk about agriculture being 10%, it's agriculture, not food. Yeah, only agriculture. It's direct emissions, not the total emissions. So it excludes what's happening in Brazil because, and that's the thing about accounting, in IPCC, every country counts for its direct emissions. Yeah, not for the emissions of somebody else. So the indirect emissions are not included in that 9%, right? But also not included is the food emissions, the rest of the food system, because we don't have data for that. And actually this paper recalculated that. And basically, so this is agriculture, this is the 9%, and that is kind of doubled if we take into account processing, packaging, transportation, retail, consumption, and end of life. And actually, packaging is quite a large percentage in Belgium. It's probably to do with bottles, glass bottles, tin cans, things like that, which are not so good for the environment and which have a big greenhouse gas impact. Yeah. And then you come up with about 20%. So it's 20%, so 1/3 globally, 20% in a Western country like Belgium. I'll end this narrative by saying, okay, what should we do globally? This is IPCC itself. Estimates that there are 4 big areas in which we should focus when changing the food system. And why do I show that? Because that will, of course, frame in a very important way food policy that is climate neutral. You can see that they're about the same size. You can also see the huge uncertainty and the range. And that's also typical of the food system. There's huge uncertainty, there's huge ranges. You see dietary change, and this mainly means less meat consumption, mainly. The second one is productivity increase, because by increasing productivity means output divided by input. So if you need less input, you exhaust less greenhouse gases. Yeah? So for example, precision agriculture, getting more out of the same amount of input, being more precise in when you apply your nutrients to crops and not, be very broad-based and have a big percentage, lost to the water and into the air. The third one is feed efficiency. So if animals are still being kept, so that's also a productivity increase. It's the ratio, it's the amount of meat produced with the amount of feed. That of course directly feeds into the deforestation problem, because one of the main reasons we're importing feed is soy. Soy being the super crop, high in protein, highest in protein of all the crops. And then the fourth one, reduction in food waste and losses. If we can get rid of that 1/3 food waste and losses, it's production that never should have taken place. But these are the four big areas. So if you would design a food policy, I mean, if I would design a food policy that would be into a Green Deal and towards climate neutrality, these would be the four areas, the main areas, and of course many measures are part of that, that it should tackle. What we'll see is that, if I link up to the farm to fork strategy, is that the first one is basically ignored. The dietary change, it is mentioned, but it is ignored. The last one is mentioned, but not a lot of things are happening there. And most of it is still in the productivity increase and the feed efficiency. This is where still most of the effort is. Why? Well, that's the path dependency. That's the other narratives kicking in. So now we arrive at the Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy. Well, you can see them here. It's food loss and waste prevention. It's there. It's mentioned. Sustainable food production, sustainable food consumption. It is mentioned. Sustainable food processing and distribution. It's all mentioned in this farm to fork strategy, which is part of the bigger Green Deal. I'm not going to go into much detail about it because it would bring me too far. So Vice President Timmermans is the kind of the architect of the European Green Deal to transform the EU economy to make it climate neutral by 2050, with an intermediary milestone in 2030. It's not only climate change, it's also economic recovery after COVID, for example. It also relates to biodiversity, because remember that biodiversity is one of our biggest planetary problems. So that's also there. A toxic-free environment, it's also part of that European Green Deal, and the farm to fork strategy, so a food system policy. And if you read the document, and I really invite you to do that, you can see that all the right words are there. It's at the heart of the Green Deal. It addresses comprehensively the challenges of sustainable food systems. It recognizes the links between healthy people, healthy societies, healthy planet, called One Health in globally. It's a strategy central to the Commission's agenda to achieve the SDGs. It should be a just transition, it should be inclusive, given also in reaction to the pandemic and the economic downturn. It offers economic gains. It ensures that the recovery from the crisis puts us on a sustainable path. So we should have green growth, ensuring a sustainable livelihood for primary producers, so farmers who still lag behind. It's all there. We're going to do it. Actually, one of the I really like this sentence that I quote from the introduction to the farm to fork strategy. It says, "It is a new comprehensive approach to how Europeans value food sustainability." What it should have said is probably it wants to be a new comprehensive approach, but at least the intention is there, right? Because if you then look at the targets, something strange has happened. These are the main targets for 2030 that have been laid down in that farm to fork strategy. And what you see is actually, oh, it's about pesticides. Yeah, that's the toxic environment. Okay, we get that 50%. That's quite a lot, because this is a 2030 target. We're 2021. That's 9 years time. That's quite a big goal. But anyway, the direction is clear. We have a pesticide problems, especially for the pollination. Bees are dying. It's probably the biggest problem related to pesticide, but even human health is said to be endangered. The nutrient problem, the obese system having too much nutrients leaking into the environment, needs to reduced by 50%. Okay, that also makes sense. And then there's this thing about antimicrobials, which means that we're using too much antibiotics in husbandry, risking also problems in humans no longer being sensitive to antibiotics. So there's an issue there. And then organic farming should increase up to 25%. And that's it. Does it this to me doesn't sound like a comprehensive list, right? So where is the rest of the system? Where are the food processors? Where is the consumer? Where is the dietary change? Yeah? And it even is very strange that they pick out one specific production method, organic. Why organic? Why should we? Why are other production methods not oriented? And 25% is quite high, because now in Europe we're at 9%. So Europe-wide we need to go from 9 to 25 in 9 years' time, which is impossible. So when I asked yesterday one of the people from DG Agri from the Commission, about these goals, his main answer was, well, it's about the direction. Because what you should realize, I'll come back to that in a minute, or what is the discussion about today is, well, this is a strategy, these are goals, but these are not yet binding. Yeah, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's the targets, and despite that, in the document itself, there is, it is clear that the transition will not happen without a shift in people's diets. Yeah, it doesn't say what needs to happen. You cannot read in the document that it needs to happen by reducing meat consumption, for example. It doesn't say that. I'll come back to that in a minute, because it's still tricky to say that, especially in many regions and countries. There's also an issue of trade, because if you do that, if you raise standards in the European Union, you risk, of course, losing markets abroad, because you become more expensive, or potatoes will become more expensive. So, or French fries or deep freeze French fries become less competitive compared to the Americans when we, fight for Japan, for example, right? And French fries is a big market for us, especially for Belgium. Yeah. So that only works when the rest of the world also raises its standards. So this is a trade issue. It is being recognized. So how has it been received? It was launched in, the Green Deal was launched in December 2019. The Farm to Fork strategy and also the biodiversity strategies were launched in May 2020. So it's no more than a year ago. So it was in the middle of the pandemic. Well, the reception was as follows. It was cherished by NGOs. It was very much legitimized by these NGOs, environmental NGOs like Greenpeace, WWF, BirdLife, and so on. Especially because it had the promise of an integrated food policy, a balanced consideration of economic, environmental, and social issues. But it was very much delegitimized, criticized by the sector, by industry, farmers' organizations, agribusiness, because of the things that I said before. Competitiveness, even a negative impact on global food security. There was this famous study by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which was not published because there was an allegation by some that the commissioner didn't want, the effects of this study to become known before the vote in the European Parliament. And then it was leaked and it was known and there was a big fuzz about it. Well, why? Because this and other studies showed that if we implement those targets, well, production will go down in the European Union. It makes sense, as standards go up. So we'll have better quality food, better for the environment, but less food. Because we can use less inputs, less pesticides. And these are all things that raise production. So there will be a production decline, but what does that mean globally? What does that mean for the rest of the world? Yeah, so in some studies, it even had a negative impact on Africa's food security, because if we produce less, we have to import some food more from elsewhere and export less from our surplus to elsewhere. So that, of course, changes the global, because we're a very big player globally. So there's a lot of criticism up to today, resulting in the food to farm strategy being a bit stuck. Why? Well, because it's not a law, it's a strategy. That's technical, I'll not go into details, but a strategy is an intention of the Commission to go somewhere. It's not a law. It means that now that all these targets need to be embedded in all these, and I've listed a couple of them here, in all these pieces of legislation, directives, that then have to translate it into national legislation. Of course, the most important one is the Common Agricultural Policy. That already failed. Yeah, these targets are not in the Common Agricultural Policy. It is now said that when the member states need to write their strategic plans, they need to take into account those targets, but it's not going to happen. So there will not be binding. It's politically not feasible. There's going to be a review of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive. There is a plant protection products regulation. There is an animal welfare regulation, feed additives. I think the list is about 20 or 30 different pieces of legislation in which this needs to be ingrained to be legally binding. Because if that's not happening, then of course these targets have no meaning. And still, a lot of that legislation is voluntary, especially if you look at, for example, the food industry. The way that advertising is done, for example, which influences people's behavior. It's a code of conduct, a voluntary code of conduct. It's not binding legislation. Although there is an intention to build a new law, an overall law, a legislative framework for sustainable food systems. But as you can see, it hasn't stopped yet. The process is still ongoing. And for each of these directives, there will be a battle to for status quo versus change. So there's quite some policy challenges to find this policy coherence across domains, but also across levels. I mentioned trade issues, so the WTO. If we raise standards and we do something at the border, America will sue us, or China will sue us. It'll take us to court. Yeah, so we cannot just, it needs to be negotiated. We want others to raise their standards as well. So there's a big issue on settling trade, because if we don't settle trade, well, then of course our high standards, our farmers are risking to be overflooded by cheaper products from abroad with lower standards. But there's also national legislation. One of the reasons why nothing or few elements of consumer of the consumer part has been integrated is that it is still national legislation. The food triangle I saw is a Belgian triangle. Yeah, so consumption and a lot of fiscality related to consumption is national competence, not European competence. Some of this is even regional. If you planning for zoning, for example, it's regional or even local, municipality based. There's some things you need to fix at the local level. We know the story in Belgium because of the nitrogen and the gas energy central in Vilvoorde. It boils down to municipality. So and there you need policy coherence as well. You also need to join different logics. Common agricultural policy has a sectoral logic. It's about commodities, beef, dairy, cereals. It's about products, about markets. Whereas human health, it's about people, it's about consumers, it's about what it's not about products or nutrients. It's about the meals and where they buy their meals, and the fact that they have control over their food environment or not. So it's a consumer logic, and then you have a territorial logic, land use, ecosystem services, nature, things like that, which the member state want to keep very much with them as well. So these different logics also need to be combined, which is also quite tricky. The other challenge is the role of instruments. Policies are at this moment based mainly on subsidies and standards. Standards means that something is, for example, the amount of nitrogen you can use, or the pesticides you can and you cannot use. That's what I mean with standards. And subsidies, well, I explained the subsidies that farmers can get. Farmers are getting subsidies, not other actors in the system, or not a lot, not consumers. And as I said, still many actions are voluntary rather than mandatory. And there's a strong reluctance to use taxes. Why? Well, because What we're doing actually, or what we're trying to do with the farm to fork strategy, is that all these external costs to the environment and to, you could also say, our healthcare systems should be integrated into the system, internalized into the system, but that would make our food more expensive. And of course, then we're coming back to this big threat of, you know, that governments are not very happy of making food more expensive. The only instrument they're thinking of is lowering the value-added tax for vegetables. But the value-added tax on food is not very high, so it's a very small. That's the only, because it's a lowering a tax, yeah. But increasing a tax, a nitrogen tax, or a pesticide tax, or carbon tax, or a meat tax, or whatever, or a fat tax, you know, this is just, there's not a lot of appetite of governments of doing that. Another thing which is happening very much is the role of technology, and you should interpret technology very broadly. There seem to be two opposing technological paradigms. One that comes out of the past, you know, the globalized, centralized systems, corporates are dominating, specialization, efficiency, resource efficiency, versus this kind of newer movement of agroecology, small scale, local, decentralized, citizen driven. And you can see in the farm to fork strategy, you can see the influence of that new paradigm. That's why the 25% organic farming is there. It hints at, you know, how these other targets should be used. But there is a big struggle between those two paradigms, where I personally think that we need a synthesis between those paradigms. So CAP also depends on national preferences, and if you, so the CAP lays out the framework, but then the member states, the regions in our case, so Flanders, Wallonia, they can choose what instruments to use. Yeah, so they have their own preferences. You know, should we spend more money on investment, or should we spend more money on nature or on climate? You know, so that also depends on these national preferences, and that also results in very different ratios of these paradigm. And so in Flanders, we're very much on the resource efficiency, like the Netherlands and Denmark. In Austria, for example, organic farming is already at 25%. Yeah, so it's very different situations across Europe. Then the biggest, and I'm almost at the end of my talk here. The biggest gap is the role of demand, the consumer. As I said before, dietary changes are necessary is mentioned, but nothing is said about what that actually means. And the EU has some levers, some pieces of legislation to influence what we call the food environment. The food environment is, you know, everything that influences the consumer when she makes her decisions, but it lacks important levers which are at national or even lower level. National level, human health; local level, how you zone, for example. For example, the city of Montpellier has decided that if a new shopping center is built, no fast food is allowed, or a certain maximum percentage of fast food is allowed. Yeah, that's a municipality-based decision that influences the food environment. Reducing meat consumption is still difficult to debate. It's even taboo in some regions and countries. Even within the country of Belgium, it is more taboo in the south than in the north to talk about reducing meat consumption. Coordination between demand and supply, however, is very important. It's a chicken and egg problem because, well, you can see that the food to farm to fork strategy is still very much supply side driven. We're gonna less inputs, less pesticides, etc., etc. But of course, these demand side, the consumer has to follow, and nothing is done to really push the consumer. And what the farm to fork strategy, what the European Commission is doing, what our governments are doing, is informing the consumer with an eco score and a Nutri-score. Yeah, so that's more information, but we know that that's not the only factor influencing consumer behavior, that the food environment also has to do with price, also has to do with availability, with advertising and many other things. But there is, as I said, a reluctance to take actions in that respect, not only because of keeping food prices low, but because it's a very cultural thing to touch on our food, to touch on our diets. In Belgium, are the holy threesome of meat, potatoes, and vegetables. It's something holy to touch on. The cow is holy in Ireland, for example. You don't touch the cow. Beef is the basis of the diet and dairy products in a country like Ireland, because it reflects, of course, the country, and in many other parts of Europe, it's the same situation. So that also explains, the challenges and the barriers that the farm to fork strategy that has the intention faces in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very fascinating, critical, insightful overview of EU policy. Are there any questions? There's no questions in the chat. No questions. I was wondering when you gave this overview of development of EU policy, what was the impact of the expansion towards Eastern Europe? This, because I didn't really mention that as a factor.
Yes, the expansion of the European Union East has also become. I mean, it's because of time limits that I didn't go into it, but I mean, one of these reforms was also triggered indeed by Eastern enlargement, and the problem that we were facing is that the West, or the original member states, well, all these farmers had these direct payments, right? So they all had, not all of them, but I mean the dairy farmers, the cereal farmers, the beef farmers, the olive oil, wine farmers, they had this, this income payment. But of course, the amount of farmers that came into the union more than doubled, because of course the Eastern European countries are rural countries, especially Poland and Romania. There are also countries in which a lot of small farmers. There are two countries that even under communism had a lot of small farmers, and they were less nationalized than Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, for instance. So they, of course, claimed, we want the same. Yeah, but then, of course, the counter argument is, but you don't have the same history. This is a compensation for historical things. Yeah, but that's not fair. That's not a level playing field. And of course, they're also right. And so what happened is that this kind of rebalancing, so every reform, even this reform, had this slow rebalancing of budgets from west to east. This was done first in the rural development part, because investment makes sense, but also in these direct income payments. Every reform, what Western farmers are getting is less and less and less. And what they're getting is a little bit more and more and more. But also that balancing act is even within countries, because you have large farmers and small farmers. There's all kinds of leveling effects in all these different reforms taking place. That has been the biggest effect, and how it very much influences how the cap was influenced. How money was distributed in the cap, but it had no impact on the instruments and the objectives in the cap, I would say. If yes. And what are the questions in the chat? No, that was the. Okay. I seem to have some famous people online. je toch even, want ik kan niet met die muis overweg. Beetje naar boven scrollen. Okay, Alan Mathijs. Hi, Alan. You highlighted that trade became important in the second stage of agricultural history, while specialization is a characteristic of your third stage, which is also an outcome of trade. That's true. But ecological resilience and sustainability requires diversification. What does this imply for a more environmentally aware trade policy in future? Is a return to the protectionism of the early cap advisable? So thanks, Alan, for that question. Alan Mathijs is a very well-known expert on the Common Agricultural Policy, a much bigger expert than I am. One of the things that I didn't mention, of course, is that trade also has benefits. In fact, we did a study ourselves a couple of years ago. I mean, trade is often blamed. Trade is based on specialization, right? I mean, and specialization started actually in history very early before Christ, right? Once there was enough surplus at a farm, people wanted to do something else, and trade started, right? That's the beginning of trade and specialization. So it actually started in antique history. It didn't start recently. It's been always part of our history, but of course it expanded more and more. So this project of globalization also we had globalization in history, obviously, but of course means of transportation increased that project more and more. But what is often forgotten is that trade also helps actually, or specialization, or the fact that we're using different parts of the world, for example, for cereal production, is also beneficial for resilience. Because many people are arguing, let's do everything ourselves, let's be protective and do everything local. But if we then hit a drought, we'll lose everything. Yeah. So isn't it more resilient to also have trade, in which you can balance out effects throughout the world? And so that's, I think, for us to a certain extent, Alan is hinting at that effect of trade. And then the question is, well, if you take into account standards, if you say, well, our wheat needs to be produced with higher standards than wheat in the United States, how do you then deal with that? Which is a tricky question, of course. So I think the answer is probably that we need some kind of, so there's talk about what is called a carbon adjustment mechanism at the border, so this is for industrial products, for example, cars. If cars are produced within Europe with less carbon than outside of Europe, you need to pay the difference at the border. So you calculate the difference in carbon, and you adjust for that at the border. It's a carbon adjustment framework that the Commission is thinking about implementing, and you could think about something similar for food and agriculture. Okay. Maybe you can show the second question. Alan's actually, yeah. How about the effect of the food farm? So Mark Aerts is asking a question. How about the effect of the strategy on developing countries with respect to food security? This is what I said earlier. Some of these studies, and the problem with these studies is, of course, they are running a scenario, and the rest of the world is not doing anything. Yeah, so it's just a scenario. Yeah, with a lot of assumptions. So if Europe is doing this and the rest of the world is not doing anything, then there may be some negative effects, for example, on food security, which was shown by some of these studies. To me, I'm reading these studies the other way around, in the sense that, well, if we don't take action, that we should identify actually in these studies negative outcomes, like a negative outcome on food security, and then figure out what we should do to counter that. Yeah. And it may be, and that's again a bit of the weakness of the farm to fork strategy, if that means that the rest of the world needs to do something. Well, we don't have control over the rest of the world. Yeah, so it's also a tricky thing, because of course we don't want food security to go down globally because we are rich enough to raise our standards, kind of situation. That's certainly not what we want. But it's certainly a legitimate question. Okay.
Are there any other questions? If not, I would like to thank Professor again for your very insightful talk, and I thank the audience for being here physically. See you at the next BrIAS Talk.
Very much.